political nationalism has expressed itself through visual media, film, television, and the internet. Today, he will be giving a lecture on the topic Russian invasion of Ukraine and global responses. To begin the lecture series, I would invite Professor Srikant Kondapalli, Dean of our School of International Studies, to kindly chair this session and welcome Dr. Peter. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheetal Sharma. Greetings to you, Professor Peter Rutland, and to my colleagues in the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and researchers. A very good evening to all of you and a good morning to Professor Rutland. Now, the topic is quite topical in the sense that we are in the midst of the invasion. We have more than a month of the invasion currently since February 24th by Russia. One of the generals in a video message was mentioning that they would wind up the war on March 4th. However, we are on March 28th, and there doesn't appear to be an end in sight to this skirmish that we are witnessing in Ukraine. Various reports have indicated that the Ukrainian back has been broken in terms of the military structures, command control, and so on. However, there is also no cakewalk for the Russians. The number of casualties have been mentioned in different ways, different figures. The cost for Russia has also been pretty high. And of course, for Ukraine, it is complete destruction as of now, with roughly 5 million people migrating to nearby Poland, Hungary, Romania, and other countries. And there is a lot of distress across the country. Now, the global responses have also been quite muted at this point of time, with the Biden administration putting across a few self-declared restrictions on the NATO and the others. On the other hand, you have also the Chinese role, which is increasing substantially. So to speak to us today, we have Professor Rutland. Please enlighten, sir, on this. We have a lot of researchers who are working on these areas. And this is a very cataclysmic event currently unfolding. So please do enlighten us. Please do also trigger more research fields for the researchers in the school. Many of them from Russian studies who are now participating in this webinar. So please do provoke them. Please do provide them with various research questions, hypotheses, and variables. Thank you. Over to you, Professor Rutland.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma and Dr. Kondapalli, for the invitation, which I deeply appreciate. I only had a chance to visit India once, and that was for a conference at JNU about 15 years ago. And I have very warm memories of that visit, and I'm still in touch with some of the people I met there. And I think understanding India is very important to any scholar of world politics today, and in particular, the course on nationalism that I teach, I do have a section on India, and I find it fascinating to follow the trajectory of Indian politics. But today I'm going to talk about Ukraine, and I'll share my screen if this is going to work. Can you see my screen okay? Yeah, good, because usually I'm a Zoom person, not a Cisco person. So this war in Ukraine is absolute tragedy. I'm still in shock. One month later, I just cannot believe that this war happened. And so I feel, as a specialist in Russia and Ukraine, I've been to Ukraine three times. I've been to Russia over 30 times over 40 years. And I didn't see this war coming. I think I'm not alone. Most of the community of Russia and Ukraine specialists simply could not believe that Russia would attack Ukraine in a full-blown war with the bombardment of cities, the destruction of entire cities like Mariupol. And another tragic irony is that those cities that are hardest hit, Mariupol, Kharkiv, they are the Russian-speaking cities of eastern Ukraine. So trying to explain this, I'll just spend about 30 minutes on my PowerPoint because I'm interested to hear what questions and reactions you have. So I'm trying to analyze why did this war happen? Why did Putin launch this war? And I'll start off with these two rather disturbing quotes to set the stage. Vyacheslav Volodin, Deputy Chief of Staff, saying there is no Russia today if there is no Putin. And then President Putin himself saying, if someone wants to destroy Russia, we will respond. Yes, it will be a catastrophe for humanity and for the world, but why do we need a world without Russia in it? And he is implicitly there threatening the use of nuclear weapons and literally the destruction of the world. So why did he start this war? I'll get my main argument out of the way in case I run out of time and lose myself in the details later on. So my main argument is the following, that Putin saw Russia as having recovered some of its lost influence and prestige in the world. In the last 10 years or so, Russia was getting stronger and stronger with each passing year. It had returned to the inner circle of great powers in the world. On the other hand, in the last 10 years, Russian influence over Ukraine was decreasing since the 2014 Maidan revolution. So we have these two contradictory trends, Russian power going up, Russian power over Ukraine going down. And Putin decided it was time to close that gap by using military force. But the invasion has stalled. He has not achieved a swift victory. He's not been able to just take over Ukraine and treat it like another Russian province. The Ukrainians are fighting back, and that goes to my fourth point, that Putin misunderstood and underestimated the power of Ukrainian nationalism and national identity. And that's in part because his own conception of Russian identity involved the denigration and dismissal of Ukrainian identity. So while the first 3 points are from a kind of realist perspective about power projection, the final point is more from a constructivist perspective about identity politics. And so that's a question for your graduate students and researchers to address the Ukraine war as a kind of test case in this debate between realism and constructivism. And the truth is you need both factors, both approaches are very important to understanding this situation. I think something went wrong, and I'm started to annotate things, and I don't want to annotate things. Can somebody advise me how I can?
We can still see your main argument slide, but you have to move on to the next slide if in case you have to change.
Yeah, I can't move on to the next slide because somehow I've slipped into annotation mode. It's not
Yes, you have
letting
to
me
go escape and then uncheck your selection. On the left-hand side, there's a pane. Yes.
Yeah.
Uncheck your selection, sir, from there.
It's not letting me uncheck, I'm afraid.
So you can stop sharing and start resharing.
Okay. How do I stop sharing?
You have stopped sharing. Now you can restart sharing.
Great. All right. Thank you for that. We're back. Thank you. Glitch overcome. So minor point to begin is that this conflict, this war started in 2014. It didn't start on February 24th, 22. In the wake of the Maidan Revolution, Russia annexed Crimea and supported the secessionist rebellion in the Donbass. And this map, the color shows the percent of the population that are native Russian language speakers. And not only did the war start in 2014, but also some of the main themes in the way that Russia frames the war were also set in 2014. So this is a poster from Crimea during the referendum in 2014, which is telling voters you can choose either a Nazi Crimea or a Russian Crimea. So this invocation of World War II, very powerful emotionally invocation, was used by the Russians right at the beginning, back in 2014. Another theme then was the threat of nuclear weapons. I was in Russia at the time, and I saw this TV broadcast on the Sunday evening on the night of the referendum, and the commentator on the state TV is saying Americans should remember we can turn American cities into radioactive dust. That's what those words say, radioactive dust. So the threatening of the use of nuclear weapons was even done back in 2014. So I would argue, and in the interest of being somewhat provocative, I'm going to push back against the John Mearsheimer position and say this is not a case of great power rivalry and a security dilemma. It is a case of imperialism, something which Indians are all too familiar with, thanks to the depredations of the British Empire. It's a case of one powerful country conquering and occupying a smaller and weaker country. What makes it more complicated in the case of Ukraine is that Russia is not really motivated, I think, by economic interests to exploit the resources of Ukraine, or even security interests, for reasons I'll get on to shortly. The main motivation is this identity politics, that the mere existence of Ukraine, Putin called it anti-Russia. The mere existence of Ukraine on the map is somehow undermining Russia's existence in his mind. Now, most of the debate in the US and certainly in places like China, this is a cartoon from the China's Global Times, argues the war is about NATO expansion, that Russia is trying to stop NATO expansion, and that's the kind of main cause of the war. And it's true if one looks at the map of the Soviet Union, and after the breakup, the Russian state retreats 500 or 600 kilometers east, and it shrinks to the borders it was in the 17th century, right? So this is a huge geopolitical setback for Russia and a kind of challenge to its identity as a Eurasian power. And as the Russian state was retreating east, the borders retreating east, subsequently NATO did expand in its wake. So I'm not denying that this is a relevant issue. I'm just arguing that it's not the only issue behind Russia's action. And I would argue the timetable, the reason to launch the war now doesn't have anything particular to do with the NATO expansion, which had kind of ceased at this point. My main argument is that NATO is a threat to Russia because Russia is a nuclear power with 6,000 nuclear weapons. And so I don't imagine any scenario in which a NATO country tries to attack Russia. It's just not going to happen. And the whole rhetoric of buffer zones and physical security through territory is a relic of the 19th century. Or at best, the first half of the 20th century. In the nuclear age, nuclear powers don't need those kind of physical borders for security purposes. Moreover, NATO, Ukraine is not in NATO, and there's no serious proposal to include it in NATO anytime soon. So it was kind of hypothetical. That said, I would agree with critics who argue it was a mistake for the US to open the door for NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. That just inflamed Russia's fears, and we can speculate on a counterfactual history. If Ukraine had renounced absolutely NATO membership, if it had got international binding guarantees of its neutrality, maybe this war could have been avoided. I'm not sure, and we'll never know, because unfortunately that trajectory was not followed. What is driving the war then? If it's not primarily about NATO enlargement, I would say it's about a broader resentment of the US as a global power. The problem is the US, it's not NATO. And this goes across the whole gamut. Cultural factors, the Hollywood and McDonald's, economic factors, the Russian economic collapse in the 1990s is blamed on the West, although I think it was a product of the collapse of Soviet central planning, and that didn't have anything to do with the West. It was a homegrown economic collapse, welcomed by the West, but not caused by the West. More specifically, Russia was angered by American military adventurism over the past 2 decades, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the US-led military interventions in Kosovo and Libya. And I agree with the critics that say that those were profound mistakes by the United States and should not have been pursued. That's absolutely true, but 2 wrongs don't make a right. Just because the US invaded Iraq in 2003 doesn't give Russia the right to invade Ukraine in 2022. All the more so that the US was responding to the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, and we were not denying the existence of Afghanistan or Iraq or trying to annex its territory to the United States. Apart from this being about being uncomfortable with the United States as a global power, the second factor, which is more important, I think, than NATO, is the European Union. That we should recall that 2013 protests began because President Yanukovych pulled out of a planned free trade agreement with the European Union. So NATO was not on the table at that point. It was just a question of economic ties with the European Union, which would have meant that Ukraine would have not been able to go into the free trade agreement with Russia. So I think it's primarily about economics in this sense. And this chart just shows on the left countries that joined the European Union, and they experienced roughly a doubling of GDP per capita, like Poland. And countries on the right are countries that did not join the European Union, and their economies have stagnated. And Ukraine in particular, as you'll see there, is kind of the worst performer in the post-Soviet space. It's now the poorest country, even before the invasion. It's the poorest country in Europe. It just fell below Moldova. It's about $3,000 per head per annum. And its GDP halved after 1990. So the existing position of Ukraine of trading with Russia as its main trading partner and as an interlocutor between the Eastern economy and the Western economies, that just wasn't working for Ukraine. It was working for Ukraine's oligarchs, and it was working for Russia, but it was not working for the people of Ukraine. So they thought, why can't Ukraine be like Poland and enter into closer economic ties with the European Union and become a more prosperous country? I just pulled this op-ed up from the Hindu last week. Ukraine, the pawn in the power game. It's a very common perception, I think, to see this as great power rivalry, Washington and Moscow, and to just cut out Ukraine altogether, just to deny that Ukraine has legitimacy, to treat the Ukrainian president, as Putin described him, as a neo-Nazi drug runner. Ukraine is not a pawn. It is a sovereign country, member of the United Nations, and has a right to make choices about its alliances, its economic alliances, its security alliances. And so it has agency, and we're seeing in the war that's going on that the Ukrainians are demonstrating their agency by being willing to die for it. Why did Putin oppose turning west, Ukraine turning west? It was partly economic interests of Russia in Ukraine. Partly it was fear of democracy, that Ukraine was not a very perfect democracy by any means. Freedom House ranks it only as partly free. But it was still more democratic, more open society than Russia. And Putin was afraid that the color revolutions could spread to Belarus, to Kazakhstan, and maybe to Russia itself. But above all, as I've said already, I think the main factor was this identity politics revealed in Putin's remarkable article from July 2021, where he kind of spelled out the 1,000-year history of Russia and why Ukraine sits on ancient Russian lands that belong to Moscow. So that was a kind of warning signal if we needed one. Now, he had a strategy for handling Ukraine, which was recognizing that Ukrainian society was split, let's say 50-50 between Russia-leaning and Western-leaning. Putin thought that through manipulation of the political system and the oligarch class, he could make sure that the pro-Western factions did not come to power and hold power in Ukraine. And that strategy worked with the election of Yanukovych in 2010, but then with his ouster from power in 2014, that strategy lost. And then the annexation of Crimea caused further polarization in Ukrainian society and the strengthening of the pro-Western groups in Ukrainian politics. For my point about Russia as a global power, why did Putin think Russia was in such a strong position and would be able to pull off this attack without serious consequences? I think a major factor was economics, that Europe depended on Russia for 40% of its natural gas and 25% of its oil, and Putin simply couldn't conceive that the Europeans would join in harsh sanctions against Russia. He just thought that Germany in particular, who were just on the verge of approving the Nord Stream pipeline, he was just convinced that the Europeans would do what they did in 2014, have some kind of token sanctions, but then business as usual. He couldn't imagine that they'd be willing to pay 500% more for their natural gas. And that's what happened. By December, the natural gas price in Europe had spiked to fivefold. And despite that, the EU as a bloc supported harsh sanctions on Russia. Second point, geopolitics. He didn't attack Ukraine while Trump was in power. He didn't know how Trump would react. Biden, however, was seen as a weak leader, not interested in Europe, interested in rebuilding the domestic economy in America. And if he was going to do anything internationally, it would be with China. So Putin saw this window of opportunity with Biden in the White House. And the weakness of the US was underlined by the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in August last year. Thirdly, on the military front, Russia had fought and won small wars in Georgia and a bigger war in Syria, and then the takeover of Crimea. So Putin thought, we've won 3 times in a row. We've used military operations effectively and relatively economically, and we can do this in Ukraine. Moreover, I'm repeating the same point. He thought Russia was in a strong position because he thought Ukrainians would welcome liberation by the Russian military. Specifically then underlining these 3 trends, the chaos of the Trump presidency and the January 6th attacks on the Congress signaled that US power was weakening. The Brexit and the resignation of Angela Merkel signaled division in Europe. And then looking back at the sanctions imposed by the US and EU after Crimea, we find they only clipped GDP growth by about 1% a year. Now, specific trends in Ukraine that worried Russia was lack of progress with the Minsk Accords, which tried to reincorporate Donbass into Ukraine. Polls showed rising support for joining the EU and joining NATO even in Ukraine itself. And then the election of Volodymyr Zelensky in 2019, at first there was some hope that he would deliver on the Minsk Accords, but then he withdrew from that. And in the past year, he's taken more steps to shut down pro-Russian political forces in Ukraine, with the house arrest of Vladimir Medvedchuk in May, and the shutdown of Medvedchuk's Russian language TV stations prior to that. Finally, and very important point is the shifting military balance that Putin saw Azerbaijan's victory in the war over Karabakh in 2020, a victory thanks in large part to drone technology that Azerbaijan bought from Turkey. And some of those same drones were now being bought by Ukraine. And the US was also delivering anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. So Putin was afraid that if he waits another year or two, the military transfers from the US and Turkey to Ukraine will increase, and Ukraine will be in a position to try to retake the Donbass by force. So I think this military factor was the key trigger which kind of pushed Putin to do something while this window of opportunity was still there. I'll skip through some of these points because I want to get to the Q&A. This is talking about the natural gas. I'll conclude by quickly providing preliminary answers to 3 important questions: the risks of nuclear war, the chances that Putin will be removed from power, and the effectivity of the sanctions. So the risk of nuclear war is serious. It's not a joke, obviously. Even if it's only a 5% chance, that's too high. I mean, we need to bring that 5% chance below 1%. Putin has been too casual in referring to the possibility of nuclear war, putting the nuclear forces on a special regime of combat duty. And the Russian military doctrine does specify that Russia is willing to be the first country to use nuclear weapons if, in their view, there is an existential threat to Russia. And Putin gets to decide what is an existential threat to Russia. So he could decide that the economic sanctions imposed by the US and the West are an existential threat to Russia and therefore justify the use of nuclear weapons. Hence, the US has been very careful to make it clear from the beginning there'll be no US ground troops in Ukraine, and no US Air Force to enforce a no-fly zone. What about Putin's hold on power and his vulnerability to social unrest or to an elite mutiny? Again, in much of the commentary about the Putin regime and the Russian state, especially American political scientists, focus on elections and public opinion, and we talk about hybrid regimes, and we talk about electoral autocracy. And there's an argument, the diversionary politics argument, that he annexed Crimea because he wanted to boost his approval ratings. So he's launched this war because he's worried about the 2024 presidential election. I don't buy that argument. I think even in the Yeltsin period, elections were rigged, were not really constraining Yeltsin's power. And under Putin, the elections have become even more of a farce, with the opposition being totally shut down, the free media as well, totally shut down, especially in the last 2 years. So I think Putin has been preparing the Russian public for this war for a long time, for many years. There's been a militarization of society, and electoral concerns just aren't relevant at this point. There are protests in Russia, but they're confined to a small minority of the population. And this was a striking protest of the producer who jumped onto the TV broadcast. But we shouldn't extrapolate from those events to the broader Russian society, most of which seem to have been totally convinced by the state media arguments that Ukraine was being run by neo-Nazis and that they would welcome Russian liberators. And we'll have to wait and see how long that social consensus lasts as news about the reality of the war seeps into Russian society. But in the short term, I don't see any political challenges to Putin. My final point on the sanctions is that Russia could expect to be sanctioned after 2014. They learned to live with the sanctions. They learned how to prepare the sanctions. They built up this big war chest of reserves. They forced many officials to bring close their foreign bank accounts and bring their assets back to Russia. So they thought they were ready for the sanctions, but the scope of the sanctions and the number of countries involved, 48 at the last count, caught them by surprise. And the damage to the Russian economy from the sanctions has been substantial. Also, it's damaging the European economy. And the global economy, with real worries about food security, because more than 25% of the world's grain is exported from Russia and Ukraine. And the war is raging. Those ports of Mariupol has been reduced to rubble, and one Panamanian merchant ship was sunk by the Russians. So no commercial vessels are going anywhere near the Black Sea for the near future. And so all of those grain exports are going to rot in the fields or in the silos. So the sanctions are crippling in the short term on the financial system, and in the long term, the lack of spare parts, the lack of software updates, the lack of microchips, colossal pharmaceuticals, colossal dependence on imports of Russian business and Russian consumers. That is going to hurt the Russian economy severely. And what happens next? I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen next. I'll give you my best guesses. This is my final slide, that we're probably going to see a military stalemate. We're going to see a repartition of Ukraine, with Russia trying to hold on to all of the territory along the northern shore of the Black Sea, at least the territory they've managed to seize so far, to create a land bridge to Crimea. The Ukrainian government won't accept that as a permanent solution, so we'll be in a frozen conflict situation probably for years to come, maybe decades to come, because Russia has been sitting with its troops on similar conflicts in Transnistria in Moldova since 1992, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia also since 94, and they're also in Karabakh as peacekeepers. So this can go on for decades, I'm afraid. The Western sanctions are damaging the economy, but not completely sinking it. And the fact that Europe still needs to buy oil and gas from Russia, the fact that China and India and other countries will continue to buy Russian oil and gas means that Putin is getting the cash flow that he needs to survive, to run his military, to run the basic sinews of the Russian state. So it will be very hard for ordinary Russians. Their economic prospects look really dismal because they're locked into this militarized regime. But the oil and gas revenue give Russia the possibility to pursue this policy for many years to come, I'm afraid. So on that distinctly pessimistic note, I will stop sharing the screen, if I can manage to do that. Maybe Dr. Sharma, you can kind of unshare me.
In the bottom, there is there's a tab called as Stop Sharing. Yes.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Rutland, for this enlightening discussion on the Russian invasion on Ukraine. A number of ideas have been debunked. Some of the conventional wisdom that we have, for instance, we were told that the Russians have invaded Ukraine because they wanted a Ukrainian neutrality, number one. They wanted Ukraine not to join the NATO. Thirdly, the NATO missile systems should not be placed in the frontline states like Poland or other European countries. So the speaker today has suggested that these are not the reasons. Although he did mention about realism, the security concerns of Russia, but these are not the reasons. The reasons are it is the case of imperialism, or it's a case of Russian expansion. That's the primary motive behind the Ukrainian invasion. We have a number of theoretical issues that are highlighted here. One is, of course, the security aspects. Although the speaker denies that there is any security dilemma between the two major powers, United States and Russia, in this case, but there is also the domestic determinants, specifically in the case of Russia, that has been highlighted in the presentation. We also have a number of other ideas that were floating that the author had jettisoned those in terms of nuclear war, for instance, or the sanctions, which he argued that would lead to a lot of damage for the Russian economy in the longer term. So those are some points. I would like to raise an issue. For example, the US President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping had a virtual talk. And in this process, Biden had suggested to the red line for China in not supporting Russia in material terms. So what are these? We did see that the Chinese have, for example, the Chinese ambassador to Moscow, a day before, he mentioned that the Chinese companies could now fill up where the 300 odd multinational companies have withdrawn from the West. Secondly, there is also the SWIFT system that is to be backed up by China in one way or the other. However, we also have a contradictory image that the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, has not renewed loans to Russia in terms of the infrastructure projects. Also, the new development bank of the BRICS also had some restrictions in terms of the investments in the infrastructure projects in Russia. So to what extent such material support would be conducive for Russia to gain initiative in Ukraine? So I was trying to bring in the other aspect here, the US and China role in the Ukrainian crisis. But before you could answer these, reflect on this, may I now request the queries from the audience, my colleagues at the school, researchers at the school. Nalin?
So you're muted, please unmute.
He's still
Nalin,
muted.
Yeah. Nalin, there is an audio issue.
He could put the question in the chat room if.
Yeah.
Then, meanwhile, may I please?
Yes, Sanjay, please go ahead.
Yes.
Nalin, can you please remove the cable and then keep the cable back in the audio so that you can probably resume the discussion after Sanjay intervenes.
Yes, excellent presentation, Professor Rutland. In one of your hypotheses, you said or you made this in your presentation that NATO is not a threat to Russia, as Russia is a big nuclear power. But the fact is that if the US had not pursued its relentless goal of expanding this organization, this NATO, it is unlikely that the present war would have been taken place. This is my argument. Even George Kennan and Henry Kissinger opposed NATO expansion. Even Kissinger categorically stated Ukraine should not join NATO, and even warned that if this principle is not adopted, the drift towards confrontation will accelerate. Mikhail Gorbachev stated several times that West had assured him that NATO will not expand it. So this expansion had no logic whatsoever when United States is expanding this organization towards east of Europe at the western border of Russian Federation. So this is my thing. This is a very illegal argument by the West that NATO should be expanded. Actually, NATO was established in 1949 just to prevent or the counter Soviet and socialist presence in Europe. And in counter, Soviet Union established Warsaw Pact in 1955. And then the two blocs fought a Cold War for nearly 4.5 decades that ended with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and dismantling of the world and the socialist system. Second point is, you rightly mentioned, I totally agree with you, that you mentioned that the energy issue is or massive gas pipeline from Russia to West is one of the key issues central to the Ukraine conflict. I totally agree with you. But the third point is that this is very important nowadays for who study international relations. But this conflict between Russia and Ukraine has brought multiple questions to the fore on the validity of international law and even the validity of and in bid to isolate Russia, the world has imposed some of the most wide-ranging sanctions seen in the recent times. As a war in Ukraine now enters, now already in second month now, failed to prevent the war. This United Nations failed to prevent the war. So is it necessary to them something we have to do, that United Nations should be very strong, and even the Secretary General of the United Nations just appealed to the Russian president, you should prevent the war, you should stop this war. So restructuring of United Nations is now necessary, particularly the Security Council. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sanjay. Professor Rutland, would you like to respond to these, and then, or you want to collect some more queries?
No, there's plenty to discuss, and I'm afraid I will forget if I wait any longer. So I can tackle both of those briefly. First of all, your point about China. Yes, China is a key player, and its position has been very complex and not straightforward, because the invasion of a country, crossing the borders and annexing part of its territory, that violates China's core principles of territorial sovereignty and integrity. And so they're not very happy to see Russia doing this to Ukraine. So at the level of international law and principles, what Russia is doing is a real problem for China. On the other hand, they're happy to see the US pushed back by Russia, and they're also happy to pick up the economic opportunities that are falling their way because of the sanctions. So I think China's position is very, they have contradictory tendencies. And from an economic point of view, to be more specific, you mentioned the Asian Investment Bank caution about stepping up investments in Russia. And that's because China's dependency on trade with the EU and US is 10 times higher than their trade with Russia. So that these Chinese companies cannot afford to be sanctioned. When Huawei was sanctioned by the US, it crippled the company. And so China is worried that if they get too far in support of Russia, including sending weapons and including stepping up investment, that could trigger sanctions against China, and that would damage the Chinese economy. And that's another priority for the Chinese leadership, is to maintain economic stability. So I think China's position is very complex. There was an interesting article by the Russian scholar Alexander Lukin in the newspaper just 2 days ago, where he kind of analyzed the debate within China. You've got different points of view within China about whether China should stay neutral or should support Russia. And so that debate is ongoing in China. On the question of NATO expansion, I agree that if NATO had not expanded, probably this war would not have happened. On the other hand, I would say that doesn't justify the Russian invasion. So the NATO expansion is a contributory factor, but it's not. That doesn't justify the leveling of the city of Mariupol with 400,000 people in it, women and children living in shelters, being starved into submission. NATO is a defensive alliance. The first time that Article 5 was triggered was after 9/11. So Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia had all experienced being invaded by Russia. In Poland's case, they've been invaded by Russia, 5 or 6 times in history. Most recently in 1945 and 1939 and 1921. And so Poland, when it became an independent country in the 1990s, lobbied President Clinton, very hard for permission to join NATO. And they were afraid, what if Vladimir Zhirinovsky wins the election and becomes president of Russia in 1996? He'd threatened to bomb Lithuania with nuclear weapons to force it to join the Soviet Union. So there were real fears that motivated the Central European countries to want to join NATO in the early mid-1990s. And because it was a defensive alliance, I don't think Russia has any right to object to Poland joining an alliance that it wants to conclude, which is a defensive alliance. It's not about Poland wanting to attack Russia. Yeah, I think that covers the main points. So I'll invite other questions.
Okay, Nalin, if you have done the audio check, then yes, Nalin. We still can't hear you. All right, let me call Professor Vijay Lakshmi.
Yeah, there's some hands raised.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Professor Rutland. That was a very interesting and I would say somewhat different story that we've been hearing. But much of it in India too, there's been a very active and rigorous debate on the need for a uniform norm that we need to have in terms of understanding this world that's unfolding. So the issue of norms that should govern the states is a very lively one for India. And I think that dictates some of our recent positions as well. And it has been, also the base for which we are looking at the Russian actions and the causes for Russian actions, as well as American actions, not just today, but about, say, from the last, from 2000 onwards, from the time of, the global war on terror. But Iraq certainly is eerily reminiscent for us in many ways. But my main 3 observations, and embedded in that is the question to you, is number one, you mentioned Putin's miscalculation. Did you also think that he miscalculated not only that Biden was weak, but it was also a very polarized America, and therefore there would be not that much of, more united stand against Russia's actions and more, Congress jumping ahead and saying, let's give more to the Ukrainians, let's send them more, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see that? The second observation about miscalculation was about old Europe and new Europe coming together. And united Europe, literally, after Brexit and, various other things. From the time of Cheney, we were told, let's have a new democratic order, and, all that sort of thing that went on in America. So old Europe, new Europe coming together, and will they really take the pain of prolonged, shortages of gas and so on? There has to be a reckoning about how, alternative supply routes and indeed supplies of oil and gas, how can they be managed, even if you say that you are, constantly with the Americans, etc. The third observation question to you is, now that you mentioned the nuclearization or the ramification of nuclear, dimension in this conflict. And my question to you, or my thoughts on this would be, are we now really looking at a situation where nuclear deterrence is dead? In other words, every country now would probably argue, especially the threshold countries, that look, if we had nuclear weapons, such a thing would not happen to us as it has happened to Ukraine. That's one. And the other is, what about Russia-US nuclear discussions, on various things? We were expecting a trilateral, in fact, nuclear discussions, including China, which was pretty much on the cards in terms of negotiations, but that seems to have been completely missing. So are we in somewhat of a stage where we are thinking the unthinkable again, with this nuclear voice that's coming out? So what are your thoughts on that? And finally, how would you think about US and China coming together at all? Do you see any rapprochement there, or would you say the US focus on Russia and this conflict, et cetera, is so high that they may not be so involved, or they may be a little less focused, or maybe giving it a little breather on Indo-Pacific, in which India is a vital stakeholder and the strategy has been laid out, etc. So these are some of the thoughts, and you may answer some of those embedded questions if you so will. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, on the last point first, it's possible that the US and China could come out of this with a better understanding of each other's role, because they have common interests. They have common interests in stabilizing the global economy, and I think they have common interest in adhering to the norms of international law and the United Nations. So, which I think Russia has violated. So I see many more points of common interest between the United States and China than between the United States and Russia. And so hopefully we will see some progress on that front. And this relates to your first question, which Dr. Deshpande also raised, the question of the United Nations and the ineffectiveness of the UN Security Council, because that's why the UN was created, to stop this kind of war, and it failed. And it failed for multiple reasons, but obviously the veto powers of the 5 permanent members, including Russia, is a huge structural problem. So I think it's time to get rid of the P5 and the special powers. But structurally, I think it's impossible to reform the UN. I don't think there's any way that they can change that. I'm not an international law specialist, but unfortunately this war has really exposed the uselessness of the UN. But we still, as a global community, we still need the UN. We need something like the UN to specify and enforce these global norms. On the nuclear proliferation issue, yes, I think you're absolutely right. You spelled it out very well, that these threats of nuclear weapon use by Putin are basically undermining mutual deterrence, because he's using nuclear weapons to deter the US from getting involved in the war, and he's using it to promote his own war. So it's a kind of one-way deterrence. So this does show that a nuclear power can coerce a non-nuclear power like Ukraine and use nuclear weapons to scare off everybody else. So that is not a very good precedent to set. And yes, your second point, this will send a signal to other countries. If you want to avoid this happening to you, you should get nuclear weapons. So that's a terrible signal to be sending out. Final point that you raised was the question of Putin's miscalculations about the US response and the European response. And yes, I think he was extrapolating from what happened in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, when he was very careful in 2014. At first with the little green man, at first they pretended they weren't Russian soldiers because he was afraid of the Western response. And he saw that the Western response was quite weak, just targeted sanctions on some individuals and some companies. And so, and that was 8 years ago, and that was, before Trump, before Biden. And since then, US power in the world has decreased, such as the exit from Afghanistan. And so I think he was very confident that the American society was polarized, was in chaos, and there wouldn't be a unified response. Likewise, in Europe, he saw Europe as very divided and worried about economic recovery after COVID and new government in Germany. So he didn't think there would be a decisive response from Europe either. Now, in the long run, you know, and Putin is playing the long game here, maybe he will be proved right. You know, maybe the Europeans will get tired of the economic costs of the sanctions and the high energy prices in a few months. And maybe they will, you know, Hungary's already wavering. Maybe other countries will kind of peel off from the sanctions. So it may yet be the case that Putin is kind of proved right. Likewise in the US. So the US, because the US is an energy exporter, it's not as badly hit by the rise in oil and gas prices. But again, in the long run in the US, it's possible that the public will kind of lose interest in Ukraine and will move on to something else. So that's very possible. We'll just have to wait and see.
Aline, are you ready now? No, we can't hear you again. So let me turn to Colonel Kaushik Ray and Dr. Raj Yadav.
Firstly, Dr. Peter, I thank you for such a lucid presentation, which brought so much of clarity to us on the issue. Sir, I have two questions to you. Firstly, do you foresee a kind of transition in the internal dynamics of NATO and the so-called European security? See, assurance or the concept of collective deterrence, which is a part of the American thought process, it has suffered a kind of a jolt. Although a non-NATO member, Ukraine has been a NATO partner in terms of military assistance and training. A direct military assistance has not come in this war to Ukraine. Do you feel that European security will take a new color now? And more so, if you observe the European Union, which was so far an economic and soft political entity, has now come to the fore and has started sending military equipment to Ukraine. Is it the harbinger of a collective European security sans the US? And where would Germany stand in this evolving construct? My second question to you, sir, that we have seen Russia has been diplomatically isolated in this situation. And would they be looking at a global military alliance as an aftermath, similar to the now defunct Warsaw Pact in the future? And in that case, where would China place itself, considering the new no limits partnership of China and Russia?
Would you like to take one more question?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Dr. Raj Yadav, can you?
Yes, sir.
Great.
Sir, good evening, sir. And Professor Rutland, it was really nice presentation, and it was quite clear and lucid. And of course, the questions that already many of the professors, they have asked and they have discussed and you have replied, have clarified most of the queries, but only and since most of the part you have already explained, but my point is only about the economic diplomacy. The relevance of the economic diplomacy, how relevant is the economic diplomacy, and how strong can this economic diplomacy play its role in order to resolve or in order to bring down peace in this kind of scenario. Else, of course, you have tried your level best, and we really got enlightened. So thank you so much.
Yes, well, the economic diplomacy, I guess, we've got the sanctions from the West, and then we've got economic cooperation continuing with Russia and China, and Russia and India. So I guess the question of economic diplomacy is the Western economic diplomacy is using sanctions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And you know, the record of the history of sanctions is mixed, that they are not usually very successful. They can trigger more aggressive behavior. If you think about the World War II and the US sanctions on Japan, you know, stopping selling copper and oil to Japan in 1940, that helped to encourage Japan to attack Pearl Harbor and attack the Philippines. So sanctions have a mixed record. And the only clear, I think, example of sanctions succeeding was South Africa, where the sanctions did help to persuade the apartheid regime to give up power. But of course, in South Africa, there was also a decades-long struggle for freedom by the population, by the African population. So it wasn't the sanctions by themselves, it was the social unrest that forced down the regime. So I'm not optimistic, based on that historical record, that the sanctions will change Putin's behavior. You know, so we'll see how that goes. But given the trouble that the Russian economy is in, because it was very heavily integrated, 50% of Russian GDP was traded. You know, 50% of consumer goods and food was imported. You know, 100% of the microchips were imported, and they're going to have to replace all of that with trade with China and India. And it's not going to be easy. Just physically, the infrastructure or the railways are not up to it to conduct all of that trade over land with China. It's just not going to happen. So the Russian economy is really crippled from the point of view of growth prospects. The first set of questions about NATO, yes, I think it's problematic that, as you referred to, the NATO military cooperation with Ukraine and Georgia, even before they were considered to be members of NATO. So this has been going on for some years. You know, the Ukrainians and Georgians sent troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. They were getting weapons from NATO. They were getting NATO help in rebuilding their ports and so on. And in retrospect, we can see that this maybe it would have been smarter for NATO not to do all of that. That was provoking Russia. And was it benefiting Western security? No. Was it benefiting Ukrainian security? No. And so I think again, it's easy to be wise after the event, although plenty of people, as you say, at the time were criticizing NATO for taking these initiatives. So I think when the history books are written and the responsibility for this tragedy is parsed out, the NATO expansion is part of the problem. I wasn't trying to argue it's not relevant at all. I was just trying to argue that there are other factors going on, such as the identity politics dimension, which I think were equally or more important alongside the security dimension. I don't see the EU really developing a strong military identity. Certainly it will be stronger than in the past. But given the nature of modern warfare, the logistics, the communications, transport systems required, they're still going to need the US to maintain a kind of coherent military capacity. So we'll see, yes, some very important changes with the doubling of defense spending in Germany. So there will be some movement, but I think those developments will take place within the NATO paradigm, which again there are many tragic ironies here that the Putin was trying to push NATO back, but he's made NATO even stronger and its commitment of its members more resolute. Putin was trying to take over Ukraine because he thought Ukrainians are really Russians, but Ukrainians now, most of them hate Russians, which was never true before, not for the majority of the Ukrainian population. They had very friendly ties to Russia. Many of them have relatives in Russia, and they had differences of opinion about policy, but there was no antagonism or hatred. But now there is, because people are seeing their own cities destroyed by missile strikes, and it doesn't make any sense at all. And yes, they can blame Putin, but the Russian society is behind Putin to a large extent. So this is why it's particularly upsetting for me to see Russia doing this, because it's sowing enmity which will last for many years, that was just not necessary, absolutely unnecessary.
Thank you. We have 3 more hands raised. Dr. Nirmal Panda, Dr. Amrish Dhaka, and Sauradeep Banik. Quite a few in this round. Nirmal, can you go ahead?
Sir, very good evening to you. I am just a government servant. I have been your student, and I have been lucky to listen to you at Central University, Gujarat, and a couple of other places. I am not a doctor. My humble request, you can call me Nirmal. Sir, my question is to the speaker, the professor. I have got a couple of questions. I am not sure how I will frame these questions, but I will try framing these short and simple questions, sir. The very first question is, sir, although I'm not a student of economics, but these sanctions, the Western sanctions on Russia, I find these sanctions to be, to be criminal against small nations. I mean to say, against humanity, I must say. I know Russia has invaded, there are a number of war. Ultimately, the war brings, disaster. That is for sure. But also at the same time, economic sanctions also bring disasters for small economies, small nations, which all are dependent on, and that too in a situation which is when we claim and we, claim to be globalized and liberalized. How do you see these Western sanctions? Number one. This is my first question, sir. The second question is, I'll come back to our situation, to India. How do you see India's position vis-a-vis the Quad? There are our own Indian media. I'm watching. The Indian media is criticizing the government's decision. I don't know. Somehow they are criticizing. They are saying India is in a very bad situation. It is a wrong thing. We have not, a number of things. You are sure. I'm sure, sir, you are aware of these things. How do you see India's position vis-a-vis the Quad? This is my second question. And my third question is, sir, do you see a possible alliance among 3 big economies, the Russian economy, the Indian economy, and the Chinese? I mean to say, do you see a kind of alliance, possible alliance coming up between these 3 countries? Thank you, sir.
Amrish? Amrish, are you around? Mr. Banik, would you like to take a shot?
Yes, sir. Sir, my question is pretty simple, that what is the future of UN? If this kind of thing is going on around the world, then what is the future of UN? Because in the past also we saw that failure of League of Nations is one of the prime example which we can take. And the second thing is that, sir, what is the future of the small countries if these things happen? Because we can't rely on the United Nations anymore. Just because this kind of happening happen every time. And the second thing is that, is this a beginning of a new arm race in the pan world? Thank you, sir.
Would you like to respond, Professor Rutland?
Thank you. Yeah, yes, I don't study the United Nations very, very closely, but I do sense there's a real crisis there, that this is not new. I mean, it was also ineffective in Rwanda or in the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, or in response to COVID. So I think there are severe problems with the UN, and I don't know how to fix them. And maybe we need the small countries, the countries that are being pushed around by the big powers. Maybe they need to form a new organization, a new non-aligned movement, 2.0 kind of thing, to address this problem. And maybe India could play an important role in that. But that's just speculation on my part. Well, leading on from that to Dr. Panda's points, and he raised the possibility of an alliance of Russia, China, India, economic alliance, which of course there are the concept of the BRICS already, if you throw in Brazil and South Africa. But I don't think the BRICS has been terribly successful, because I think the economic interests and the political interests of the member countries are just too different. And I don't think politically and economically India and China are a good fit for each other. And bear in mind that Pakistan is moving closer and closer with China and with Russia, and is talking about Prime Minister Khan was in Moscow the day before the invasion, talking about a new natural gas pipeline from Russia to Pakistan. So I don't see, I think the future of India as a democracy, as an open economy, as a very dynamic economy, as a country that does not use military force to get its way, I think the future of India is not with Russia and China. And I don't think the future of China is with Russia either. That's what I was trying to argue earlier. So I think Russia will remain very isolated. This was a point from the earlier conversation, a question I didn't get to, that Russia is incredibly isolated diplomatically. Very few countries apart from Syria, North Korea, Eritrea, and Belarus voted for Russia in the UN General Assembly over Ukraine. Similar, very small number of countries have recognized the sovereignty of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which Russia recognized. So Russia is very, very isolated internationally. Belarus refused to send troops to invade Ukraine. I never thought I would say President Lukashenko made a wise decision, but that was a wise decision. Even Kazakhstan has been neutral on the Ukraine issue because they're afraid that Russia could invade Kazakhstan and take northern Kazakhstan, where there's ethnic Russian population. So Russia is very, very, very isolated diplomatically, but that feeds into Putin's narrative of Russia as a victim, as Russia as a besieged fortress. He seems to be more comfortable that way. It just kind of proves that he's right, that everybody hates us, everybody's against us. So that's a problem, and it would be great for Russia to reintegrate itself into the global community on criteria other than threat of nuclear annihilation. Nimal's first point about the impact of sanctions on the global economy, yes, that is a real problem because the food supply, as I mentioned, comes out of Russia and Ukraine, and also fertilizers. It comes out of Russia, probably 20%, I think, of the global fertilizer supply, and the shortages and increased prices of food and fertilizer and, of course, fuel, oil, will really damage living standards in many poor countries around the world, and will lead to great suffering. And that is a collateral damage of the sanctions, which is very unfortunate. But the sanctions on Russia are not the main problem. The war is the main problem. It's the war that shut down the import-exports from Ukraine and from much of Russia through the Black Sea. So the best way to limit the damage to the global economy is to stop the war and to reopen Ukraine as a normal functioning peaceful society. I think I got all the points.
Can I ask if I'm audible?
Yes.
Yes, Ambarish, go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, Professor. Your position as an American scholar is very much understandable, but I had some difficult situation in accepting your narrative. Number one is that NATO is a defensive organization. Is that what a defensive organization does, what it did in Yugoslavia and Libya and in Iraq? Also, the fact is important is that 8,000 Ukrainian soldiers went on duty with the American forces in Iraq. So that kind of solidarity has some reason to be, you can say, the kind of extraordinary concern that is there with the American forces or with Ukraine. So because the way the Taliban was handed over power in Afghanistan, the kind of weapons that the NATO has sent to Ukrainian armed forces, if you would have sent even 5% of that to Afghan national forces, they could have easily withheld the Taliban onslaught. After all, they were around 250,000 Afghan national security forces, and Ukrainian forces are around 550,000. So I believe the priorities were somewhere else. The second thing that I wanted to point you out is that you mentioned that you had a very pessimistic scenario that is being played out there. But I feel that this is a misplaced pessimism. The larger responsibility of pessimism lies with the inability of the West to engage Russia on many accounts. And one of the serious consequences has been that the Russophobia has gone even in the academia. You find the University of Florida shutting out the reading halls, removing the names of the halls, which practically have nothing to do. I mean, removing name of Karl Marx. Russia is no longer a communist country. The University of Italy removing the Tchaikovsky's chapters. So Russian literature, Russian music, Russian art and aesthetics at common level is being targeted, and at the elite and strategic level, the Russian isolation which Russia is being targeted for, I think the approach should have been to engage Russia. So war would slow down, but it is the time for America to show its leadership, to re-engage and I think Putin is sensible enough to re-engage with the West on better terms. So rather than planning for more weapons in Ukraine, rather than devising more new ways of isolating Russia, I think the approach of NATO and US should be to engage Russia and unwind this everything, which would have been done. The war could have been easily avoided. Thank you very much.
Shall I answer straight away? I'm all in favor of engaging with Russia. That's what I've been doing all my life. I've been a student in Russia already in 1982 in the Soviet period. And the past 6 years, I've been on the board of the Presidential Academy of Public Administration in St. Petersburg. So I've been constantly trying to engage with Russia, and I'm not alone. I'm just giving that as a personal example. But we speaking for the American academic community, had no desire to shut Russia off. But and even after the annexation of Crimea, you know, these contacts continued. I continued to serve on that board. But the invasion of Ukraine just takes things to a different level. So I think we can't just do business as usual when this kind of war is raging. And on the question of NATO and Yugoslavia, you know, there are different points of view about that. I mean, I think the NATO intervention in Bosnia was necessary. I mean, they didn't intervene for 4 years. You know, they just used UN peacekeeping between 91 and 95, and that just wasn't working. And then the massacre of 8,000 Muslim men and boys at Srebrenica in July 95, that was just the final straw. So NATO switched to military intervention, bombing the Serbian positions, and that brought peace very quickly, and it brought an end to the killing. So I think the Bosnian intervention was justifiable. Kosovo is more complicated because the Kosovo Liberation Army was kind of deliberately using attacks on Serbian police to kind of provoke retaliation, which then eventually led to NATO intervention. So I think it's a very complicated story, but whatever was going on in Bosnia and Kosovo and Libya, for that matter, which was approved by the UN, the humanitarian goals were real, were uppermost. The United States was not trying to annex Kosovo. The United States was not trying to benefit itself economically. Whereas Russia and Ukraine is a different story, because Russia is trying to take over the whole country, basically. That if they hadn't been stopped militarily, they would have taken over the whole country, tried Zelensky as a neo-Nazi war criminal, and who knows what else would have happened if they'd been able to occupy the whole of Ukraine. And so the weapons that the NATO powers are sending into Ukraine has enabled the Ukraine to survive. And so, yeah, I think I covered all the points, or at least within the time available.
Thank you very much. Are there any other follow-up queries and observations? Please keep that brief. If there are none, let me thank Professor Rutland for an excellent presentation and clarifying a lot of doubts that we have. And let me hand this over to Arshi Dua for the vote of thanks. Thank you very much. Arshi, are you around? Yeah. Let me do the honors then. We have had a wonderful discussion. We thank Professor Rutland for an excellent presentation. It began with the Russian motives. What could be the motives in invading Ukraine? A number of propositions which are pretty attractive to the kind of audience that we have today with the School of International Studies researchers, faculty members. I think this was quite a fabulous presentation. We take something home with the observations on constructivism, on identity politics, on neorealism, also the Russian As you mentioned, Professor Rutland, the imperialism, the kind of policies that President Putin had followed in the recent past. This is quite an interesting presentation. I think this will have huge takeaways for many of our researchers, and we want to profusely thank you for the presentation. Also, Professor Sheetal Sharma, my colleague in the Center for European Studies, for introducing the speaker. Archie is, I think, will get back in a while. Let me thank her for organizing all these, doing the poster, approaching, the audience, and so on. And of course, the questions that were raised quite interesting, tangentially different from each other. We want to thank once again the colleagues and researchers who participated in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Srikant, for chairing this session. May I take just a couple of seconds to thank the chair of the session, the participants, the faculty members, those who raised very pertinent questions and significant from our perspective also, not just from the Western or the Eastern, but India also being located in the entire debate. And finally, I would like to thank Professor Peter Rutland for being there with us early in the morning and sharing his ideas, his thoughts, and getting dispelling some of the myths that are there in Indian media or in perception. And thank you once again, sir, and we'll keep on calling you and getting enlightened by your ideas in future as well. Thank you very much once again. Namaskar.
I appreciate the invitation and the questions, the tough questions. And as you can see, I'm still thinking through this. There are no easy answers. And I think it's very important to get Indian scholars involved because you have the relatively objective position in this conflict. You can see it from, you can see, I think, the strengths and weaknesses on both sides, on all sides. And that's the path to mutual understanding, hopefully, is that if each side starts to understand the approach, the frames used by the other side. Thank you again.
Thank you, sir, and have a good day. Bye-bye. Bye. Good night.